Hello, everybody. We're going to do a presentation on reducing waste and saving energy. My name is Colleen Fisk.
And I'm Tyler Katzmar.
I'm Clay Good.
And we work for the Renewable Energy Alaska Project. This lesson goes along with one of our curriculum called AK EnergySmart. We want to acknowledge the land that we are on. Tyler and I live and work on Dena'ina Elnena, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Dena'ina Athabaskan.
And I live and work on the Akantakuquan of Tlinkitani in Southeast Alaska in Juneau.
As we're thinking about reducing our waste, we really want to acknowledge the use of these lands has been in Indigenous hands for thousands of years, and they've been the stewards of these lands. And as we think about reducing our waste and using our resources more wisely, we especially want to consider and acknowledge that stewardship of the land as we go on. So diving into this presentation, we're talking about waste and energy, and they're all really closely related. We have things like it takes energy to grow food, and of course, water to grow food. We have waste from our food. There's leftover, there's wasteful energy that might happen, that you can use food products or byproducts to generate energy. There's a lot of overlap that happens and interconnection between them. And so as we think about this, reducing our waste really has impacts in these other areas. We're going to focus on the energy side of things. And there are a lot of benefits to reducing our waste, right? There's all of these things that have to do with less land pollution, trash and plastic in the ecosystem. Like I said, we're going to focus on the energy use, but there are a lot of benefits to reducing our waste. And we think about this because of something called embodied energy. And this is the energy that is consumed with all of the processes associated with something. So if you're extracting material from the ground, you have to transport it. You have to use energy to maybe mold it or separate out the different components of it. You have to make the thing, transport the thing, maybe store it, and then your use of it. And all of those things, all of those energy pieces are combined together to talk about the embodied energy, as opposed to like just the energy that it takes to use something. We also want to think about the disposal of it, right? And so if we're reducing our waste and not disposing as much, that reduces that embodied energy and therefore the carbon footprint, because we still rely so much on fossil fuels for producing all of our energy. And how do we reduce waste? Well, we want to think about these 6 R's. Now, a lot of people talk about the 3 R's, which is reduce, reuse, recycle, but we really want to consider some of these other R's, such as rethinking how we're using something, refusing to actually use certain materials or not needing to use certain materials, repairing things that we need it, all before we actually recycle something. A lot of times we get focused on the recycle piece, but we really need to think about all of the ways that we can reduce our waste, not just with recycling. So we're going to go through some of these and think about how we can reduce our waste. And then Tyler, Clay, and I are each going to talk about ways that waste gets reduced in our own communities. So if we think about reduce, one of those R's, you want to think about reducing the amount of materials used, but also reducing, remember we're talking about energy waste, overlap here. How can you reduce the energy used? Can you reduce the packaging for something? We've had a huge rise in the use of plastics worldwide. 380 million tons of plastic are produced every year worldwide. So if we start reducing how much that we're actually using, if we're refusing to have that plastic as part of it, if we're rethinking as well, if we need that plastic as part of a packaging, then that helps reduce that amount of plastic that is actually being used. And 3% of this plastic, which doesn't sound like a huge percentage, but when it's 3% of 380 million tons, that is suddenly a huge amount of plastic that actually ends up in the oceans. Another way to think about this is reducing your energy use. We talk a lot about energy efficiency and conservation. So if you want to have solar panels and have your house use renewable energy, if you reduce your energy use first, then you don't need as many solar panels therefore reducing the amount of materials needed to make those solar panels to, be able to power your house with those. Reuse is another important one. So even before we try to recycle it, right, we want to be able to, can we reuse this first and also repair it? Can something be put into use as something else? Can we repair something or fix it up before it goes to its end of life, before it goes to the trash or recycling? Can it be, can we use parts from one thing to put into another? I mean, there's a lot of car junkyards out there for just that purpose, to be able to reuse these different parts. So there's a lot of different ways that we could potentially reuse things. One of the things that I do is I have old pallets from a local feed store that I put up for my recycling bin so that I can have a spot for my recycling outside. There's a lot of ways that you can do this though. And then recycling, which is our last R. We want to do all those other things first before we start recycling. So can you use recycled materials, right? Think about if you are making something, whether you're a business or even at home, can you use recycled materials to build something? We think about, there's a lot of ways, a lot of different types of materials that could potentially be recycled. We'll get into that a little bit more. But paper, aluminum, those are major ones. And aluminum is cool because it can just continue to be recycled. It doesn't degrade, so that you can continue to have an aluminum can, melt it down, turn it into another aluminum can. Office paper is a little trickier. Same thing with plastic. It's not like you can just recycle it and turn it back into that other thing. So considering what types of items that you use as part of it is important, and how it actually gets recycled. There are enough plastic bottles thrown away each year to circle the earth 4 times. So if instead we can recycle those, or better yet, in the first hand, not use them in the first place, of course, but if you do have them, right, sometimes it's unavoidable, recycle it is going to be better than getting it thrown away. I also want to make an important point as we're talking about plastics. The numbers on those plastics and those little triangle with the numbers just tells you what type of plastic it is. Does not necessarily mean it can be recycled. It doesn't mean you can just throw it in with whatever you have with any type of plastic recycling. It's really important to understand the difference between those. And that's why it's really important to understand how your community specifically reduces its waste. It's also important to think about supply and demand. So if there isn't somebody who's going to purchase that end product and have a use for it, then it can't be recycled either. So for example, in Anchorage, they collect glass and they crush it down. Anchorage and MatSu collect newspaper and it gets turned into insulation and other materials. So we used to be able to recycle a lot more plastic in the US and in Alaska, but China no longer takes most of our plastic. The plastic that does get used tends to be used in the US. So for example, this Trex decking material is made from that plastic film and some waste wood, and they turn it into this decking material. But they can't take all of our plastic. There's not enough demand for it. So that's why we can't recycle as much of that plastic anymore. If there isn't someone who wants it, then it just can't be recycled. So we're going to talk a little bit about specifically how we reduce waste in our different communities. We're going to start with Tyler in Anchorage.
Thanks, Colleen, for that great overview. I do live in the municipality of Anchorage on Denina El Nana. And, waste and reducing waste in Anchorage is a huge deal because there are about 300,000 people who live here, and we make a ton of waste, especially the residents of Anchorage. That's me and that's you. So, waste in total makes up about 12% of Anchorage's greenhouse gas emissions. So curbing the amount of that waste that ends up in the environment is really important. And the municipality of Anchorage, along with Solid Waste Services, our waste utility in Anchorage, has set these goals and created these programs to help us divert unnecessary things from ending up in our landfill. So, most residents of Anchorage have curbside pickup for both waste and recyclables. If you choose to get curbside with recyclables, that's all mixed recyclable material. Everything goes in one bin and it gets taken out by the trash trucks, once or twice a month. You can also drop off recyclable materials that have to be sorted, as well as glass has to end up at the Anchorage Recycling Center. You can't just throw your glass in the trash or curbside pickup. You have to take that in to the recycling center. The cool thing about that glass is that most of it stays in Anchorage and gets crushed up and used in construction projects and road work. SWS also has a really cool curbside organics community composting program. So organic materials that maybe end up from the kitchen that you're not going to use, you can give that to SWS and they'll use it to contribute to a larger community compost pile, which community members can use. And then outside of the municipality and SWS, there are other organizations and programs that are out there to really focus on those 6 R's. Like the Anchorage School District, ASD, has an awesome mixed paper recycling program, and that diverts, hundreds of tons of paper away from the landfill every year. I think it's really important that we know our landfills have lifespans. And once we fill these things up, we have to build new ones. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't really want more landfills popping up in the place that we call home. And all these programs by SWS, the Muni, the school district have diverted 3.7 million pounds of trash from the landfill just in 2018 alone. So these programs are really important. There are other groups like Remade who hang out at solid waste distribution centers, and they pull things that could end up in the landfill to maybe repurpose, reuse, or repair them. The Muni also, the landfill, I guess, has a really awesome methane recapture program. So they're capturing the methane that would be escaping from the landfill, turning it into usable electricity and using it at the base just north of town. And there's also a pretty nifty new electric garbage truck out there roaming the Muni roads this year. So if you keep an eye out and you see a garbage truck with those 4 white boxes on the bottom of it, those are lithium ion batteries, an EV garbage truck, pretty nifty. And there are also some private companies and businesses who are doing their part, like Blue Market. They work off of a zero waste model where you actually bring in all your containers and you take everything home with you from their bulk bins in the containers that you bring in or the containers that they supply. And there's also some pretty cool municipal plastic bag bans, stuff like that. So it's really important that we do things right in Anchorage because we have a lot of people contributing a lot of waste. And then there are some really cool resources that you can find in Anchorage. If you have any questions as to what goes in the recycling, there are some great resources out there. It's important to note that none of those plastic clamshell containers should end up in the recycling. There's some great resources out there for you to go to. And then all this stuff, it ends up at the Anchorage Recycling Center, where it's just packaged up, baled into really dense blocks, taken to the port and shipped down south, where it enters the wider recycling market down there. And then some things like glass and newspaper actually stay in the state, which bolsters our local economy. So it's really important to know what goes in the recycling and what goes in the trash.
All right, thank you, Tyler. I'm going to talk a little bit about MatSu. So I grew up out here also on Denina lands. After a couple different moves, I lived in Anchorage for several years, but I'm really happy to be living back in MatSu again. And I and my family recycled as we were growing up. One of my big motivations for that was and still is that there are these great trails that are near the landfill, Crevasse Moraine. And I would be on these trails and see these plastic bags all over the landfill as they were blown out from the landfill onto the trails. These trails are also purposefully there so that, like what Tyler said, when these landfills, when we fill them up, we have to move somewhere else. And those trails are specifically there so that when they fill up a certain cell, a certain area at the landfill, they then have to clear out and open up new areas, and they use these trails. So the slower that we can make that happen, the longer that we can keep using those trails. So that's one of my motivations. And the Valley Community for Recycling Solutions is one of the bigger ways that this happens. So they do recycling. They also have a reuse section. They do a lot of education around reducing waste. They're very much, even though they get their money from selling the recycling materials that they collect, they really want to see that waste reduction first. They're a nonprofit that is really passionate about that and have that done first. And they do that with their energy use as well. They are a gold LEED certified building, so very energy efficient building. They put solar panels up. So you can see this is 2020 energy use. In March and May, they had awesome energy production from their solar panels. And they also helped set up recycling collection stations at the different transfer stations around the valley so that can be collected and brought to them. Like Anchorage, there are different stores and businesses that are trying to reduce waste. So for example, MatSu Rebuild is one of them that collects used building materials, everything from roofing to doors and old light fixtures you can go and get so that you don't have to buy them new. There's a pretty strong community of, pretty good thrift stores. There's the culture in this community is very much around farming. A lot of people have chickens. Like I get my eggs from the neighbors, from chickens next door. A lot of people do composting. There's a lot of local farms and farmers markets. So you have your food local, and you're not necessarily not having that energy use of stuff brought up, but also you can get things without all of the packaging that it necessarily comes with. And there is a plastic ban in Palmer and Wasilla. And like Tyler said, that newspaper that gets collected in Anchorage and also in MatSu, their business is based out of MatSu called Thermocool that uses it for insulation and hydro seeding and other things as well. Here's an example of some of their materials that they have around education for recycling. Their program works really well because the people who recycle are really well educated about what can and can't be included. And that makes their product really highly valuable to those who buy it from them. So they have really detailed materials about things that can be recycled or not, and it all has to be sorted. Here's the next page of this. Like, for example, I learned looking at this again with fresh eyes, I saw, oh, look, canning lids and metal lids from jars can go in with steel food cans, right? So that's these things, they have this really specific. And then they also contain a reuse store with different materials that people can reuse. Packing peanuts is a great one, right? Keep that styrofoam out of the landfill and just reuse them. So that's in MatSu. I'm going to turn it over to Clay to talk about Juneau.
Hey folks, down here in Juneau, if you're familiar with the landscape a little bit, you know that land is at a premium down here, or just a little community sort of smeared out along the edge of the foot of a mountain next to the ocean. And so landfill and waste management is the critical issue here and has been in the region for years. Juneau does have curbside recycling and has for a half a dozen years or so now. They collect all of our mixed clean recyclables, all the different plastics. We don't have to pay attention to the number on the bottom. We can't put films and that kind of sheet material in there. And no glass is accepted in our recycling. If we want to recycle glass in Juneau, we have to collect it ourselves and take it out to the recycling center, out at the landfill, where it's crushed there and put in the landfill as roadbed into the landfill or into a section where they can mine later, I suppose. But it's used to reduce the volume of the glass that's in the landfill. Juneau for a few years now has had a wonderful new entrepreneur who has developed the Juneau Compost program, which is curbside or drop-off composting for garden waste, yard waste, and kitchen waste. And so here is one more opportunity to not have to import at expense soil amendments and fertilizers. We can get them right here from our own compost here in Juneau and help strengthen our local economy and keep that cycle going there. We have drop-off stations around the community where folks can drop off their clean and sorted recycling, aluminum, metals, and cardboard and sorted paper. And so that makes it more convenient, so people don't have to drive to the recycling center that's at the landfill in Juneau. The big issue that's been facing Juneau and a number of communities in Southeast lately is we are about 30,000 people, but in a normal summer, we get as many as 1.5 million visitors, and a lot of their waste ends up in our landfill. And so Juneau is taking measures to restrict the amount of solid waste coming from the cruise ships to help extend the life of our landfill. You can see in that picture in the middle on the right of my slide is the little tiny wedge that's left for our landfill. And another thing we're doing in Juneau is we already plug in one of the docks we have for cruise ships. We want to make all of our cruise ships plug into port so that they're not wasting their energy and fuel and compromising our air quality by wasting that energy when we have energy available that's clean and hydro right here in the community. So these are some ways we want to reduce waste in Juneau, both at the landfill and at the energy pump too. So on to you, Colleen.
Thanks, Clay. Hopefully that gave you guys some ideas on how energy can be and waste can be reduced in your own community. Maybe you live in one of these communities, maybe you live in another one that has recycling or other waste reduction materials. We really want you to think about that waste reduction and thinking about these 6 R's, where you're thinking about these in order where recycling is last. So rethink what sort of materials that you're purchasing. Refuse certain materials if you're able to, like plastic straws or lids, or if you're designing something, reduce the amount of materials used, repair things, reuse things. And at the last, if you can't recycle, if you can't do the rest of that, then recycle something. And if you need resources, there is a statewide organization called Alaskans Against Litter Prevention or for Litter Prevention and Recycling. And so alparalaska.com, definitely check out their website. And I'll end with this little funny: recycling is just common sense, which is probably why most people don't do it. So thank you and good luck.